I took vitamin D every day for 30 days and tracked what actually happened to my sleep, my joints, and my energy. Some things changed and some things didn't, and one result generally surprised me. Vitamin D might be one of the most talked about vitamins on the internet right now. Depending on who you ask online, it can improve your energy, your sleep, your immune system, your bones, and your mood. That is a lot of expectations for one single nutrient, and it raises an obvious question. What actually happens if a real person takes it consistently for a month and carefully tracks the results? Instead of just reviewing the research like I normally do on this channel, I decided to do something a little different this time. I turned my living room into a small research lab and became the human guinea pig. In research terms, this is called an N=1 experiment, meaning the sample size is exactly one person, and in this case, that person is me. Now, to be clear, this kind of experiment is still primarily anecdotal, and N=1 experiment cannot prove anything scientifically, but it can show what happened under fairly controlled conditions when I took vitamin D every day for 30 days while avoiding other supplements and trying to keep other variables stable. For transparency, the dose I used in this experiment was 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 per day, which is a common over-the-counter amount sold in stores. Although individual needs can vary and dosing decisions should always be discussed with a healthcare professional. Instead of trying to prove anything, I treated this as a structured observation to see what patterns might emerge. And one of the patterns that appeared later in the experiment was something I honestly did not expect. One thing you might notice is that I did not go to a lab and get my vitamin D levels tested before starting this experiment. As a scientist, that would obviously provide more precise data, but I intentionally did not do that for a simple reason. Most people who decide to try a supplement do not start with lab testing. They usually just take it and see how they feel. I also did not suspect I was deficient to begin with, so the motivation to establish a laboratory baseline was fairly low. Instead, I wanted to see what would happen using simple observations and measurements I could track at home, because that is much closer to how supplements are actually used in real life. What I did differently, however, was track a few specific things consistently so the experiment would be a little more structured than typical real-world use. Think of this less like a clinical trial and more like a carefully observed real-world case study. And as always, decisions about testing or supplements should be discussed with your physician. So, could the same thing possibly happen to you? Possibly, but biology varies quite a bit from person to person. Genetics, diet, lifestyle, sleep patterns, and baseline nutrient levels can all influence how someone responds to a supplement. Because of that, the results you are about to see should be interpreted as one real-world example rather than a universal rule. What it can do, however, is show how claims about vitamin D might actually play out in everyday life when someone takes it consistently and pays close attention to what changes. My name is Marcus. I am the research scientist and the wellness watchdog. You are watching Health Sense or Nonsense, the channel where I spend hours reviewing journal studies, systematic reviews, and clinical data so you don't have to. In other words, I spend a lot of time reading scientific papers so you can keep your weekend. Before we get into the week-by-week results, there is one important biological detail about vitamin D that many people do not realize. That detail actually explains why some people claim dramatic benefits while others notice almost nothing at all. The answer often has less to do with the supplement itself and more to do with a person's starting point. I will come back to that idea in a moment. But first, it helps to understand how this small experiment was set up, so you can see exactly what was measured. For the experiment, I took a standard over-the-counter dose of vitamin D once per day for 30 days. I did not take extremely high doses or mega doses, and I intentionally chose a typical supplement amount that many people already take. I also avoided taking other supplements during the experiment so I could reduce as many variables as possible. Perfect control is impossible outside of a laboratory environment, but the goal was simply to keep things reasonably consistent so that any changes would be easier to notice. Rather than relying on vague impressions like, I think I feel better, which is usually how most of us judge supplements, I tracked 3 specific things that people often claim vitamin D improves. Those 3 measurements were sleep quality, morning joint stiffness, and afternoon energy. These were chosen because they are commonly mentioned in both wellness marketing and scientific discussions about vitamin D physiology. Tracking them consistently allowed me to compare patterns over time rather than relying on memory or subjective impressions. The goal was simply to turn everyday observations into something a little closer to usable data. To track sleep, I use a basic Fitbit device that records sleep duration, nighttime movement, and how often I wake up during the night. It is obviously not a full clinical sleep study, but wearable devices do provide reasonable, consistent longitudinal data. For joint stiffness, I rated how stiff my joints felt each morning using a simple scale from 1 to 10. If you are over 40, you probably know the exact kind of morning stiffness I'm talking about. For energy levels, I set an alarm every day to exactly 2 in the afternoon and rated my energy and focus at that moment, since many people hit a natural dip around that time of day. I also tracked my daily step count to make sure I was not simply exercising more or moving more during the experiment. Increased physical activity can influence sleep quality and energy levels, so it is important to monitor that variable as well. One of the biggest confounding factors in any self-experiment is the placebo effect. The placebo effect simply means that when people expect something to help them, they often begin noticing improvements even if the treatment itself has little direct biological impact. By using a few simple measurements and repeating them consistently, it becomes a little easier to separate real patterns from expectations. Before beginning the experiment, my sleep was fairly average. My Fitbit typically showed around 7 hours of sleep per night, with occasional awakenings during the night. Morning joint stiffness was usually around 4 out of 10, particularly in my knees and lower back. Nothing severe, but noticeable enough to track consistently. Like many people, I also experienced a mild afternoon energy dip, usually sometime between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. That pattern is fairly common due to natural circadian rhythms, but it was still useful to measure during the experiment. During the first week of the experiment, very little changed in the measurements I was tracking. Sleep duration stayed almost identical to baseline, and nighttime awakenings looked roughly the same as before. Morning joint stiffness remained around the 4 out of 10, and afternoon energy ratings did not move very much either. From a biological perspective, this actually makes sense. Vitamin D does not function like caffeine, and it does not produce immediate stimulation. If it did, the supplement aisle would probably look a lot more like the coffee aisle. The way vitamin D works inside the body is slower and more gradual. Vitamin D behaves more like a prohormone, which means it is converted into an active hormone through several metabolic steps. Vitamin D produced in the skin or consumed through supplements must first be converted in the liver into a compound called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. After that, it undergoes another transformation in the kidneys before becoming the active form that cells can actually use. Because of that process, vitamin D works more like building infrastructure inside the body rather than flipping a switch. Many biological processes simply take time. Week 2 of the experiment was slightly more interesting. Around day 10, I noticed a small improvement in my afternoon energy ratings. The change was not dramatic, but the numbers moved around 5 out of 10 to closer to 6 on several days. That was enough to notice, but still modest. At that same time, I remain cautious about interpreting that change too quickly because expectations can influence perception. Clinical trials are designed to address exactly that problem. In randomized trials, researchers often include placebo groups so they can separate psychological expectations from biological effects. Several meta-analyses examining vitamin D supplementation have found that improvements in subjective symptoms, such as fatigue or mood, can vary widely between individuals. Some people report improvements while others experience no noticeable difference. This variability is one reason nutrition research often requires large sample sizes. By week 3, another pattern began to appear in the data I was collecting, and this was a result I honestly did not expect. My morning joint stiffness score started trending downward. Instead of hovering around 4 out of 10, they often were closer to 2 or 3 out of 10. The difference was not dramatic, but it was consistent across multiple mornings. My sleep data also showed a small drift around the same time. Total sleep duration remained similar, but the Fitbit recorded slightly fewer nighttime awakenings, suggesting a modest improvement in sleep continuity. Sleep continuity simply means staying asleep for longer periods without waking up repeatedly during the night. Vitamin D receptors exist in several areas of the brain involved in sleep regulation, and some researchers have proposed that vitamin D may interact with melatonin signaling pathways. Melatonin is a hormone that helps regulate our sleep-wake cycle. These are the most recent studies I could find on this topic, and several journal studies and clinical trials have explored this connection. The evidence remains mixed, however, and researchers are still investigating the exact mechanism involved. If you appreciate evidence-based explanations without the hype, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. My goal with Health Censored Nonsense is to separate health claims that are supported by evidence from those that are mostly marketing. So subscribing really helps the channel. Before continuing, I should also include a quick disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Any decisions about supplements should always be discussed with a qualified healthcare professional. Now, let's return to the biological detail I mentioned earlier that helps explain why responses to vitamin D vary so much between individuals. One major factor is baseline vitamin D status. If someone already has adequate vitamin D levels in their bloodstream, adding more through their supplementation may not produce noticeable effects. However, if someone begins with a deficiency, supplementation may have a much more visible impact on their physiology. Vitamin D deficiency is actually fairly common in many populations. Some estimates suggest that a substantial portion of adults, often reported around 30 to 40% depending on the population and cutoff used, may have levels below what many clinicians consider optimal ranges. This can occur for several reasons, including limited sun exposure, living in northern latitudes with long winters, spending most of the day indoors, or consistently using strong sun protection. Because of this variability, the same supplement can produce very different experiences for different people. By week 4 of the experiment, the overall pattern was relatively stable. Joint stiffness remained slightly lower than baseline. Sleep interruptions appeared somewhat reduced, and afternoon energy ratings were a little more consistent compared with the beginning of the experiment. The changes were noticeable, but still fairly subtle. Importantly, there was no dramatic transformation and no sudden surge of energy. The results looked more like gradual adjustments rather than immediate improvements. This observation highlights an important reality about nutrition science, that the idea that a single nutrient will dramatically transform health within a few weeks is often more a product of marketing than biology. Many of the well-established benefits of vitamin D appear over much longer periods of time. Clinical trials studying bone density, fracture risk, and immune function frequently run for months or even years before meaningful differences appear. That does not mean vitamin D is unimportant. Vitamin D plays a well-documented role in calcium absorption and bone metabolism, which is essential for maintaining bone density throughout life. It also interacts with immune cells and inflammatory signaling pathways. Several systematic reviews and meta-analyses published in peer-reviewed journals suggest that correcting vitamin D deficiency can improve certain measures of physical function, particularly in older adults or individuals with clearly low baseline levels. So, what should you actually do with this information? A simple decision framework can help make sense of it. The first step is considering your personal risk of vitamin D deficiency. Factors such as limited sunlight exposure, darker skin pigmentation, living in northern climates, or spending most of the day indoors can all increase the likelihood of lower vitamin D levels. The second step is considering testing. Physicians typically measure vitamin D using a blood test called 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which reflects the body's circulating vitamin D levels. If levels are low, supplementation can be recommended by a healthcare professional. If levels are adequate, additional supplementation can produce little noticeable change. If you decide to supplement, tracking real-world outcomes can still be useful. Monitoring sleep quality, energy levels, and physical comfort over time can help you understand how your own body responds. One final point is also worth mentioning. More is not always better when it comes to vitamin D. Extremely high doses taking over long periods can lead to elevated calcium levels in the blood, which can create health complications. Moderate dosing guided by medical advice is generally the safest approach. Before we wrap up, just a quick reminder that this video is intended for educational purposes only and should not replace medical advice from your own physician or healthcare professional. So, what is the final verdict here? Is vitamin D health sense or nonsense? The idea that vitamin D will magically transform your health within 30 days is mostly nonsense. However, the idea that maintaining adequate vitamin D levels supports long-term bone health and contributes to overall physiological function absolutely makes sense. If you found this breakdown helpful and appreciate evidence-based discussions without the hype, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps the channel reach more people who want science instead of marketing. My name is Marcus. I am a research scientist and the wellness watchdog, and you have been watching Health Sense or Nonsense. Thanks for spending the time with me today, and remember that good science rarely promises miracles, but it often gives us something even more valuable, a clearer understanding of how our bodies actually work. Wellness Watchdog out.